Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Unveiling Ceremony to honor the children who never returned home from residential schools. And our keynote address by Kimberly Murray, the Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites Associated with Indian Residential Schools in Canada. My name is Deborah Young, and I'm a PhD candidate and recently joined the School of Social Work as its newest faculty member. And it's also my honor to be your master ceremony for today's event. I would like to acknowledge that we are currently on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. As a visitor in this territory, it's important for me to acknowledge these lands as its original custodians, ancestors, as well as the present-day caretakers. I also want to mention that we are going to be discussing and sharing very difficult information this morning. If you are in need of support, there are a number of telephone numbers available to you. These numbers are located on the pillars and outside of the walls, and Dr. Karen Sewell from the School of Social Work can also direct you to these numbers, and she's in the back row there. Finally, I would like to remind the photographer, the audiovisual, and the media not to take any videos or photographs when Elaine, the knowledge keeper, is either smudging or drumming, including any personal photos by cell phones. Now, I would like to introduce you to Elaine Kiknosway. Elaine is a proud member of the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation in northern Saskatchewan, and she is from the Wolf Clan. She is Swampy Cree through her biological mother and Chippewa through her biological father's side. She is a 60 Scoop survivor and is the co-founder of the 60 Scoop Network, which was established in 2015. Elaine returned home to her community and her biological family and mother in her late 20s. She is a longtime community advocate in the areas of child welfare, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, healthy families, and Indigenous wellness. She is also the Indigenous Trauma-Informed Counselor, an Ontario wedding officiate, a blanket exercise facilitator, and since 2012, the trainer of an Indigenous full-spectrum doula and an Indigenous death doula. She is a traditional helper, a knowledge keeper, a traditional dancer, a singer, drummer, and a carrier of ceremonial teachings. Welcome, Elaine.
So, bonjour, honey, tansi, kwekwe, wache sego, Elaine Dishnakas, Mangandodum, Pelicaneros, and Donjaba, Anishinabek, Aki, and Donji. So, I live here on Algonquin territory, and I've been a guest here since I was 14. And I used to work over there at the Loeb building back in the day. I was one of the ones that took care of kids. It was a get off the street program for us as Indigenous youth. And they said, what do you like to do? And I said, I think I'm good at taking care of kids. So that started my journey of understanding violence in children or witnessing, right? And when you're talking about Indigenous children or childhood, there's always times of our life, right? And it depended on the time you were born, whether it was the 1800s or the 1900s, right? Because you keep on hearing 96 or 97, the last residential school closed. So that's almost 100 years, right? And then you have to acknowledge the other schools that were open in 1831, all the way to the 1700s, all the way to the 1600s. So in some territories, it's over 400 years. So it's not just the conception of Canada, it's the conception of lose or don't have the Indian in the child. So when we're talking about our childhoods, we're either interrelated or we're direct loss, right, of family members. And so when we're talking about the family member, we're talking now about a grandparent. We're talking about a great-grandparent. We're talking about a great, great, great grandparent. And the loss of community, the loss of communication, and loss of the whole being. We keep on talking about the mind, body, spirit, and health, right? And we're still undoing or unraveling or decolonizing. So the more that we talk about this, and it's not just an Indigenous perspective or an Inuit or a Métis perspective or on reserve or off reserve, I always ask, how many in this room are treaty people? You need to all raise your hands. You need to all raise your hands because you're all treaty people and you all carry a role and a responsibility. Because it's not just the Indigenous voice, it's how you take your own ownership. Like, did you have a family member that worked there? Or did the gardening or even built it? Right? Because that's that larger intergenerational conversation. The merging of the worlds that came together. The merging of, before the change. And I always then bring it forward. I was born at a time, and many of us were born at a time in our 50s or 60s. We were born at a time of grief. And then you go into the 40s or 30s, you're still born at a time of grief. And then you go to the 20s and down to childhood, you're still born at a time of grief because you still carry the load. And it's heavy sometimes because grief is hard. Grief is hard to hold. So when we light our medicines, sing our songs, bring us back to what they say, they're calling our spirit home, we're actually calling our relations home too. Come back to us because we miss you and we love you still today. We do. And we tell our children, and we tell our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, because behind it all is we're really good at having kids. And we tell our children the truth. We tell them the truth interrelated to what happened, to never again. And then we tell them, go to school. Learn their way, but learn our way. And so it's like the merging of the two worlds, and challenge what they're teaching you. Because there's always a book that they have to follow, but our rites of passage, our ceremonial, our inherent rights, our language, our songs. I always tell my son, who's 19 right now and goes to Algonquin College, take the world, go fearlessly. Whatever that fear is, just push it aside. I know I'll deal with you when I have to, but I need to go do this now. And that's what I do when I'm getting myself steady to speak in public. Because if I told you if I'd been told when I was 10 years old that I would be standing up here in front of like all these people, I was an overwhelmed, traumatized child. So there would be no way I would have believed you, because I was in the foster care system in Canada. And we still have our relations in the foster care system. So that's that conversation of how do we stop taking our kids? And that's your responsibility too. It's not just an ownership on one side. So when we're looking at these vamps, we're looking at 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 20 and beyond. Because the reality is to infinity and beyond, I'll always be Cree and Chippewa. I can't take it off. And if you take off your orange shirt at the end of the day, don't forget. You have a responsibility. Take that ownership And it's hard to do because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. But the reality is, uncomfortable is reminding you that something's wrong. Something's wrong. So you pray to that spot. You give comfort to that spot. You acknowledge, you listen to that spot, but then you go forward. You go forward. So I'm going to light my smudge. I ask that no photography be happening. And then just ground yourself. And I also have some cedar essential oils. And that's from the matriarch of the Kiknosways on the Walpole side. She said if it gets really overwhelming and you feel like you're disassociating or feeling that anxiety, grab a little cedar oil, put it on something that you can smell throughout the day, and ground yourself, because you are the roots, you are the seeds, you are the wind, you are the rays of light, you are the stars, you're the star beings to this life, to create prayer.
Okay, thank you, Elaine, for your wise words and opening up our day in a good way. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Jerry Tomlin, our our provost and vice president, to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you, Elder Elaine, for reminding us that truth and reconciliation belongs to all of us. I'm a guest on these lands, but reconciliation is not something to be carried out by Indigenous peoples alone. This is a journey that we're all on, and hopefully we're all proceeding in a good way. I'm really honored to be with you today as we take the time to pause and reflect on this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and to honor the lives of missing children from residential schools. I'd like to first acknowledge the residential school survivors in the room and thank you for being with us. The courage you have and continue to demonstrate to all of us is truly inspiring. Very special welcome to our keynote speaker today, Kimberly Murray, who's the Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites associated with residential schools in Canada, and of course a Carleton alumnus as well. I'd like to extend a special round of thanks for their service and attendance today to Gina Wilson, the Deputy Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, Shirley Ann Off, the Director General, Communications, Department of Justice Canada, Gail Mitchell, Assistant Deputy Minister for Women and Gender Equity, Danielle White, Assistant Deputy Minister from Indigenous Services Canada. As one of the three co-chairs of the Carleton University Strategic Indigenous Initiatives Committee, I'd like to offer my continued commitment on behalf of the university to furthering the conversations and progress on our own Kinamagu and our Learning Together Indigenous Strategy and our Carleton-specific calls to action. These calls have been complemented by a $2.5 million donation from the Joyce Family Foundation, matched by an additional $2.5 million from the university, which has allowed us to begin to mobilize many of our good intentions. A full implementation of the 41 Kinamagu calls to action will support positive long-term change at Carleton, and we all have a role to play. And it's a journey, I'll repeat that. During our lifetime, we will always be on this journey, and we need to be proceeding in a good way to make progress, but being humble to realize you don't correct the wrongs of many generations in a single generation. And again, I just want to reemphasize the responsibility as settlers on these lands to practice allyship. Reconciliation, as I said, is something that is shared by all of us in this room and in this country. Finally, I'd like to also thank and acknowledge the work of and efforts of Deborah Young for bringing us all together today and for your work as a lecturer and a PhD candidate within our Department of Social Work. And once again, thank you all for being here today. Miigwech, and I'll turn it over to, oh, you're going to introduce? I'd like to turn it over to my fellow co-chair, our Associate Vice President, Indigenous Initiatives, for some words. Her name is Kahenti Horn-Miller. How could I forget?
Don't walk away with the mic.
It is Friday after all.
It is.
Kahante yujats agskare wake ni I kanyaka haga newanjoto. Watkanuaradun danazawagwego. My name is Kahante Horn-Miller. I am Ganyaka Haga, also known as Mohawk. I'm from Kahnawake, and I bring greetings. Kahante. You might know my mother, Kahante Netta. Yes, I did. I've been here as a guest in these territories since 2014. First as an assistant professor, now as an associate professor, and also as holding the inaugural role of Associate Vice President, Indigenous Teaching, Learning, and Research. And this work that I'm doing now is a culmination of many years of watching, learning, experiencing. I went through university and didn't have the benefit of having any Indigenous professors. So we're now in a very different place. And I'm really fortunate to have seen and experienced those changes and also being a part of the change. I remember in the early 90s just beginning to learn about residential schools. I remember that moment and thinking, what is that? I didn't even know that I had family members who had been at residential school or had been at the day school in Kahnawake. And I remember thinking, oh, there's something I have to learn. And this was after 1990. So this was a very unique time. Many of you don't know that time. But the work here at Carleton and the work that I do specifically in terms of in forwarding and implementing the 41 calls to action are part of my own journey as part of the legacy of the residential school system and the day school system. The work that we do and the thinking behind it is all to set that path forward, because in my culture, among the Haudenosaunee and Kanien'kehá:ka, we have this concept of, thinking ahead and thinking about the coming faces. The Algonquin Nation uses the term 7 generations. We use the coming faces, and you all are those coming faces. But then again, your children and my children, your grandchildren and my grandchildren, and so on, are also those coming faces. And we are in a very interesting position in an institution, a post-secondary institution, to set that path, to change the outcomes. So what we do as the legacy people is we take that anger and that hurt and we channel that into good work so that the path that is before you all is a good one, or it's a better one than we had. And so, I'm very proud to be part of this work, this core work here, setting this forward for you and working with my colleagues and teaching about good allyship, teaching about my own culture, teaching about, the other ways of thinking about the world so that path forward, we can all walk along it together. And that is what I think, Deborah and everyone here has done is they're setting that path forward. They're enabling us to have space, to have those difficult conversations and figuratively hold hands and walk forward in a good way. So, Nyawagoa. Thank you all for joining us today.
So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Sarah Todd, my new boss, my supervisor, my mentor. And she's the director of the social work program, School of Social Work.
Hello, everybody, and on behalf of the School of Social Work, welcome. I want to echo all the thanks that Jerry offered, but particularly I want to say to Deborah, we are just so grateful from the School of Social Work and the university for your imagination, for your faith, and for your hard work to make today's event and this project possible. You have a beautiful ability to strengthen connections between communities, and this is just such evidence of that, so thank you so much. For the profession of social work, and social work education in particular, the practice of remembering past harms is central to us building a better future for how social workers engage and work with marginalized communities in general, but Indigenous communities across Canada specifically. This artwork helps us learn how to do this. In its scope, it speaks to the large-scale social issues and legacies of residential schools. But in the details of each individual vamp, we're reminded of the uniqueness of every child who is lost. For social workers, always keeping in mind that balance between the social and the impacts of what we do and the need to attend to the unique individual is central to our work. This art, in helping us to learn how to remember in such a way, teaches us how to shape a future that can hold the social and individual together in our minds and our hearts. I'm so grateful to all of those who helped with this project so that it can be in the School of Social Work and guide educators and students to that future. Thank you so much for contributing so that the impact will be on the school and the profession for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very touching. Your words were very touching. Now, where am I here? Make sure that we're, okay. So once again, I would like to give thanks to Elaine for her opening prayer and her wise counsel and her smudging. And I also like to acknowledge our distinguished senior leaders from the public service and also from Carleton University. And I also would like to acknowledge my aunties, Doris and Esther, and my dad, Ken, who have traveled from Manitoba to bear witness to this unveiling. And part of this commemoration is also for them and their siblings, because each of them have survived a system designed to erase First Nations, Métis, and Inuit identities, cultures, languages, and traditions. And it was also a system that we know that led to the death of thousands of children. As Indigenous people, we've always known what type of places residential schools were. Survivors shared the truth over and over and over again. And it wasn't until the children who never returned from home raised their voices did the world really start to listen. The empty chair and the baby moccasins and medicines are the visible and painful reminder of that lost child who never returned home to their parents. And this is why we have a day dedicated to Orange Shirt Day, or National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. May we never forget or repeat the harms of the past. Now, before I share on how this commemoration project came into being, there are a number of individuals I would like to first acknowledge, because without this support, this project would never have happened. I would like to acknowledge Miss Michelle Thompson, the Cree Mohawk artist who was instrumental in the installation of the Vamps. Unfortunately, Michelle isn't able to join us this morning because she's recovering from COVID, which is our reality that we're all living in right now. But from early on, these tiny Vamps revealed their stories to Michelle, perhaps because she's a young mom herself. And through her talent and skills, Michelle was able to reveal the pathways that were hidden from view for so long. Michelle took these 356 Vamps and created a visual story that needed to be told, and I'm grateful that she was able to walk with me on this journey. And I actually forgot to acknowledge, there is a little one in the audience with us today, and I just wanted to acknowledge her spirit and her mom who is here with us today. So thank you for bringing her, or him, the baby. The School of Social Work and the Center for Indigenous Support and Community Initiatives, the Faculty of Architecture, and most recently, the Ottawa School of Art, who supported the project through financial contributions and various in-kind support. Sarah Fafme, the architect graduate student, and Daniela Visman, my daughter-in-law and also an architect alum, lent their artistic talent to create the beautiful commemorative plaque that is behind me. Canada Beading Supply became a valuable partner in this project from day one and demonstrated what an allyship can look like. This locally owned beading store in Nepean donated over 150 beading kits, rallied their beading community together, and also served as a pickup and drop-off point for over 150 Vamps. Metis has joined us today, to you and your team for walking with me as well. It's also important for me to acknowledge my own ancestors who came before me, including my family members from Peguis First Nation and Apasquac Cree Nation. These are the lands of my ancestors since time immemorial, before the days of reserves, the Indian Act, Indian agents, and residential schools. We are gathered here this morning to honor and remember the thousands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children who either lost their lives to violence or disease while attending residential schools, including those children who vanished and never returned home to their families. While these young spirits may be gone, they were never truly forgotten by the families who loved and missed them. Can you imagine if your child was taken from your arms and placed in a school far away from home and then simply vanished without word? Or being told your child has died but not given the opportunity to bring them home for a proper ceremonial burial. Being a mom of two, I know I would not recover from that. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released a report on missing children and unmarked burials because survivors' testimonies consistently told stories of their friends and siblings either dying or going missing at the school. Survivors spoke of unmarked graves on the school grounds, and at the time, the TRC identified 3,200 confirmed deaths, but the commissioners were confident this was the tip of the iceberg. Over the past several months, I've seen the numbers ranging from 4,000 to 40,000 lives lost. However, for me, whether it is 1 life, 20 lives, or 40,000 lives, one child who is killed or who has vanished is one too many. We do not know the exact number for a variety of reasons, but you'll be hearing from our keynote, Kimberly Murray, about her important work and the challenges that we face. We do know, however, that each First Nation, Métis, and Inuit child matters because they were and continue to be loved by someone. They were not and are not faceless individuals. They are someone's daughter or son sister or brother, cousin or friend. Their stories become unfinished, like the single vamp in this installation. And it is our families and communities who suffer the consequences because our own stories are also now incomplete. So we grieve with the families and we stand in solidarity as we push for change and to seek the truth. Each one of us holds a responsibility to ensure that the colonial violence and racism comes to an end, that the legacy of the residential school era and the impacts of settler colonialism is taught and understood at all educational levels, from kindergarten to universities. When the recovery of the 215 unmarked graves first came to light in May of 2021, I knew I had to do something. Then many more graves were uncovered in the months that followed, even at the schools that my parents went to. The journey of the Vamp Commemoration Project is one small contribution to a much larger societal conversation that needs to happen. But with each small contribution, it adds voice and awareness to these critical issues, which have long been dismissed, ignored, or not believed, even though survivors have been telling the truth ever since that first child was taken from their parents. These stories are not new to us. Many of us have experienced colonial violence personally, or we know of a loved one who has. Who would have thought that something as simple as beading could unite a community of people from different ages, ethnicities, and geographical locations? The beauty of beading is a single bead on its own, it remains unfinished, but when many beads are brought together, it tells a powerful story of resistance and resilience, only made possible by community voice and action. And community voice and community actions are the most powerful advocacy tools that we have. I believe community projects need to happen in every school, university, and workplace, with the goal to have a commemorative display in every hallway and learning space. But public displays are not enough. We must also commit to action and allocate resources to initiate the change that needs to happen. It is important for me, both as a social work student and now educator, to engage my peers and colleagues in this important conversation, as I believe every social work student who graduates from our program must have a firm understanding about the history of this country and its ongoing impacts it has in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And these are the reasons why I selected the School of Social Work to donate the journey of the Vamp installation there. It is to inform, to educate, and to commemorate. I am a child from residential school survivors. My parents lived their formative years away from their own parents and community, as did thousands of other Indigenous children, some of them as young as 3 years old. And now Canadians know, and they can no longer ignore the truth that we, as First Nations people, have always known, that many babies and children died in those schools. I am incredibly touched by the outpouring of love and grief by everyone who contributed Vamp to this project. The beaders were from all skill levels and ages. Some of my favorite Vamps were made by children and the newbie beaders, because I know how difficult it is to bead. A total of 356 Vamps from all over Turtle Island, and even one from England, eventually made their way into my home and heart. Each Vamp unique as the person who has beaded it, and many of the Vamps came with personal stories and reflections. And for me, each little Vamp represents a child taken, and I felt their presence in my home. I took the responsibility to care, protect, and honor them. And with the help of Michelle, we were able to create the pathways for the children to walk on. This powerful beaded vamp installation reminds us of the importance of the production and preservation of public memory through art. It is the reclamation of voice, community, and healing. I am grateful that this installation will find a home in this university because I believe through awareness and understanding of the past will lay the foundation for a better future. This commemoration display will be first put in public display, first at the Ottawa School of Art, then it will go to the Carleton Library for a short period of time, and then it will be moved to its permanent location at the School of Social Work on the 5th floor of Dunton Tower. And this is why I believe it is important that universities and colleges remain open on September 30th, Orange Shirt Day, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Because I believe as places of higher learning, we have a responsibility to build awareness and to facilitate conversations on difficult topics through education. September 30th gives us an opportunity to gather and reflect upon the colonial history of Canada and how this history continues to be felt today. So thank you so much. And after Kim's keynote address, you'll have an opportunity to take a closer look at the vamps. And just be careful how you approach them, although we have now a barrier, so you won't be getting close to them because they're on easels, and the easels are quite wobbly. Okay, so Kim, I'm so excited that Kim has agreed to come and join us today. I have to admit, when I took a little time hunting you down to find you, but I found you. I've known Kim for a number of years as well. I was a bit nervous because this project was a student project. It was a student-initiated project, and I was nervous that you would say no because it was a student project, but you were so grateful and you were so kind when we spoke by Zoom, and very thoughtful, and you agreed to come, so I'm just very, very, very honored that you're here. Okay, so I'm going to properly introduce you now, okay? So Kimberly Murray is a member of the Kanesatake Mohawk Nation. She is currently the executive lead for the newly created Survivor Secretariat at the Six Nations of Grand River, working to recover the missing children and unmarked burials of the Mohawk Institute. Prior to this role, Ms. Murray was the province of Ontario's first ever Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Indigenous Justice. From 2015 to 2021, she was responsible for creating a unit to work with Indigenous communities to revitalize their Indigenous laws and legal orders. Over the years, Ms. Murray championed and chaired several committees, panels, inquiries, and reports. She sat on the expert panel on policing in Indigenous communities, where it produced a report toward peace, harmony, and well-being. Ms. Murray was also the executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where she worked to ensure that survivors of Canada's residential school systems were heard and remembered, and to promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. From 1995 to 2010, Ms. Murray was a staff lawyer and then the executive director of Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto. She has appeared before all levels of courts on Indigenous legal issues. She has acted as counsel at numerous coroner inquests and public inquiries, including the Ipperwash Inquiry in Ontario and the Frank Paul Inquiry in British Columbia. She's also the recipient of numerous awards, including the Diane Martin Medal for Social Justice through Law, the City of Toronto's Aboriginal Affairs Access, Equity and Human Rights Award, the Law Foundation Guthrie Award, the Law Society of Ontario's Laura Legge Award, and in 2017, the National Aboriginal Achievement Award for Law and Justice. In 2015, the Indigenous Bar Association granted Miss Murray the Indigenous Peoples Council designation, and most recently, Miss Murray was awarded the Lieutenant Governor's Medal of Distinctions in Public Administration. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Deborah. It was so nice when you called me that day. I'm glad you were able to find me. So Sego, Seguego, Kimberly Murray, Yungyats, Ganyega Haga, Negana Sitage, Wakwaho. Good morning, everyone. What a sight to see so many of you standing out there in a sea of orange. I'm going off script right now. When I worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I can only imagine, Doris, how you feel seeing all these people coming together on this day to really have these important conversations. Who knew that we would be here and that finally this call to action would be implemented? I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation, and I recognize that Ottawa has been and continues to be the home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Metis people. I want to say Nawe thank you to traditional helper Elaine Kiknoswe for the opening Thanksgiving and the kind and beautiful words that you did to bring all our minds together as one. And thank you for the ceremony and the song, and for blessing the baby vamps. I can't think of a better way to start the day. And thank you for letting me bring the very little baby moccasins that I brought to gift to you, Deborah, and the work that you're doing. And as you mentioned, babies died being born in the schools as well. So we brought a small little baby pair of moccasins. And I want to say thank you to Provost Tomberlane, Assistant Vice President Horn Miller, who told me she had to leave. Oh, there she is. She's getting ready. And Deborah Young for inviting me here today. It really is an important day. And I want to acknowledge the survivors that are here. And the family members of survivors that are also here. I know from speaking with many survivors that days like today can cause different emotions and feelings. The TRC wrote that the process of remembering the past is an emotional journey of contradictory feelings of loss and resilience, anger and acceptance, denial and remorse, shame and pride, despair and hope. I know that the reminders of the past are coupled with hope for the future. Hope that maybe Canada and Canadians are finally seeing you and hearing you. Today I want to speak about three things: the importance of public memory, the significance of having a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and steps that universities can take and should take to further reconciliation with Indigenous people. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report and their 94 calls to action. The final report is more than the summary report. I'm going to guess most of you have read the summary report, but it has several volumes. There's 2 history volumes, the legacy volume, the reconciliation volume, and the missing children and unmarked burials volumes. Those are some of the work that I'm going to be referencing today. Several of these volumes focus on the past, and others are forward-looking. Justice Sinclair often said, we need to fully understand the past to chart our way forward. And so I encourage everyone here today to read all the volumes of the TRC report. Reconciliation is not possible without knowing the truth. Learn the truth so we can move forward together with reconciliation. The TRC wrote that survivors want Canadians to know, to remember, to care, and to change. Reconciliation is not about forgiving and forgetting, it's about remembering and changing. Volume 6 of the final report, the reconciliation volume, has a chapter dedicated to discussing the importance of public memory and how the arts and commemoration can help in this regard. We must reshape our national history, and that can happen through discussions like we're having here today, sharing and commemorating. The TRC said that Canada's national history must reflect its complex truth so that our children's children and their children will know what happened. As it's them, they are the ones that will inherit the responsibility to ensure that it never happens again. So what happened? For over 100 years, more than 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Metis children were taken from their parents and communities and placed in state-funded, church-operated Indian residential schools. The first and longest operating school opened right here in Ontario. The last school, as you heard, closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. Children were physically, sexually, emotionally, and spiritually abused. Forbidden to speak their languages, forced to learn the languages of their abusers, and told that their spirituality, customs, and traditions were not only inferior, but were heathen and savage. They were taught to be ashamed of their own identities, of their families, and of their communities. Children died at these places from disease, accidents, suicides, and criminal wrongdoing. How many children died? We don't know. We know more than the 3,000 children that the TRC were able to find records of died while in these institutions. Where are they buried? We don't know. We know some are buried in their home communities. Some are in cemeteries hundreds of miles away from their homes because Canada and the churches refused to pay to send their little bodies back home. They often never even told the parents that their children had died. Some are buried in unmarked graves. Where are all the unmarked graves? We don't know. And this is the work that communities like the Kamloops, Cowessess, Six Nations, Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, and dozens more over Turtle Island are currently doing. This sacred work of recovering the children so that reconciliation can happen. The TRC had this to say: the reconciliation process is not easy. It asks those who have been harmed to revisit painful memories, and those who have harmed others, either directly or indirectly, to be accountable for past wrongs. It asks us to mourn and commemorate a terrible loss of people, cultures, and languages, even as we celebrate their survival and revitalization. It asks us to envision a more just and inclusive future, even as we struggle with the living legacies of injustice. Arts and artistic practices like these baby vamps can serve to shape public memory in ways that are transformative for individuals, communities, and national history. By participating in today's ceremony, witnessing the unveiling of the baby vamps, you are all reshaping public memory in a transformative way. This shared experience is transformative as it causes each of you to reflect, to remember, and consider what commitment you will make and take to affect change. I want to share another form of artistic expression that was gifted to us just yesterday. Social media is amazing. Someone contacted me on LinkedIn and asked if I would play this song. It's being aired. It got aired this morning on CTV, and we scrambled yesterday to put some photographs together. You might not see because the screen in the sun, but it's the song that we want you to listen to. It was gifted to us today, and it's entitled "Bring the Children Home."
Loving families and their children today held each other closer, began to pray.
Little mountains and shoes covered the streets as the heart of a nation lost its beat.
How can anybody be so cruel? Send our children to them schools.
Silence and memory in unmarked graves. Who knows how many children we must save? Bring the children home. You can't hide the truth anymore. Bring the children home. Honor their spirits and set them free. Bring the children home. Let them rest in peace. Let them rest in peace on their land.
Now our people's stories are rich in you. How many will ask, what can I do? Look at your children and think of them too. Our people been crying for too long.
Our family's pain and suffering, it's so wrong. Come on, everybody, take our hands.
Let's stand united on this land, so this country can hear our demand. Bring the children home. You can't hide the truth anymore. Bring the children home. Honor their spirits and set them free. Bring the children home. Let them rest in peace. Let them rest in peace on their land.
Across the waters, we are thinking of you. Stolen generations happened there too. Across the border, we are thinking of you. Stolen generations happened there too.
Bring the children home. Oh, yeah. You can't hide the truth anymore. No, no, no. Bring the children home. Oh,
I want to say thank you to Michael Etherington and Vince Chichu for writing that song and all the artists that sang on it. You'll see in the credits, if you can see, that Michael wrote this song for his great auntie, who was the oldest living survivor at the time of the apology. And you see a photograph of her. Important messages in the song. Heart of a nation lost its beat. Bring the children home. Honor their spirits and set them free. And let's stand united. Call to Action 80 from the TRC called on the federal government to establish a national day for truth and reconciliation, to honor survivors, their families, and communities, to ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of Indian residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process. This call to action is found in the reconciliation volume of the final report in the public memory chapter. Today, I ask you all to move from your head to your heart, to consider and feel for the families who are grieving for all that was lost and can never be recovered. To feel with your hearts the pain that survivors and communities leading this sacred work of recovery are experiencing as they step back into their own trauma in order to find and honor the children. Today, we honor all the children that were taken to these institutions and their families. We honor and acknowledge those for whom a history of injustice and oppression is still very much alive. These baby vamps and the song gifted to everyone today honor the missing children and recognize the sacred responsibilities that exist to recover them so that their spirits can journey home to rest with their ancestors. So here we are in a colonial institution, one that I attended many years ago. What can universities, faculty, and students do for reconciliation? The TRC wrote extensively about the education system. There's 2 full chapters dedicated to the education process. The first chapter, in the legacy volume, highlights how education systems failed Indigenous children at these so-called schools. Children were more likely to spend their time working and raising money for the schools than learning. Many hours of the day were also spent converting the children and indoctrinating them into Christianity. Education has always been recognized as a powerful tool, and those running the residential schools expected little of Indigenous children. Many believed that educating children would lead to resistance. So the education delivered to Indigenous children was purposely inadequate. The TRC also highlighted the resistance, as one survivor called it, the defiance of Indigenous children, the small acts that the children engaged in to defend their integrity and to assert their entitlement to dignity and humanity. The Indian residential school system caused direct trauma to survivors and intergenerational trauma in families that continues to impact Indigenous peoples today. The TRC found a direct link between Indian residential schools and the current realities that many Indigenous people face, including chronic unemployment, extreme levels of poverty, substance abuse, and family violence. That is the legacy of Indian residential schools. The TRC also highlighted that the education system also failed non-Indigenous people. Non-Indigenous people, your parents, your grandparents, maybe even you, were wrongly taught that Indigenous people were inferior, not human, and less worthy of fundamental rights and freedoms. The TRC recognized the important role that universities have in contributing to reconciliation and emphasized the need to reform curriculum. For so many years, the history of Canada's colonial treatment of Indigenous peoples was not included. Call to Action 10 speaks to the importance of developing culturally appropriate curriculum that reflects Indigenous perspectives, realities, and histories. The voices of Indigenous people have been silenced, omitted, and purposely excluded in the past. These voices must be included and must lead the work of developing new curriculum. The revitalization of Indigenous languages is another key area of focus for universities. Call to Action 16 calls upon post-secondary institutions to create degree programs in Indigenous languages. This is important for so many reasons, including that languages contain the values, the laws, and guiding principles of Indigenous communities. Indigenous languages were explicitly attacked at Indian residential schools, and students were often punished for speaking their Indigenous languages. I don't know what happened there. Indigenous language speakers must be valued and hired to do this important work of language revitalization within universities. We see far too often that greater value is placed on Western educational degrees and credentials than what Indigenous knowledge holders and language speakers possess. I know that Carleton, through the work of the Strategic Indigenous Initiatives Committee, has recognized this and has created its own calls to action to recognize and appropriately compensate Indigenous knowledge keepers and language speakers. As we continue this journey of reconciliation, I encourage everyone to interpret the TRC's calls to action broadly and think about the meaning and the spirit about the calls and determine how you can help move each one forward, regardless of which entity the call to action may be directed at. Consider your personal, professional, and institutional commitments to reconciliation. I cannot leave this conversation today without bringing it back to my mandate as the independent special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked burials. In the short 3.5 months that I have been in this role, survivors and communities have identified several key requirements and priorities to assist in the sacred work of recovering the children. Sufficient funding to conduct the searches and to hire the technical and legal experts to do the searches and analyze the data is needed. This funding must continue beyond the original 3-year commitment. We know this work will take years to complete, and communities need to know that Canada and provincial governments are in for the long run and not just at election time. Access to records is an ongoing issue. 5 million records were collected by the TRC from the federal government and church entities. These records need to be accessible to communities immediately. In addition, entities that did not produce their records need to do so. There are also entities outside the settlement agreement parties that hold records, municipal, provincial governments, including police services, and universities. Carleton University has been in existence since 1942. That means for 54 years, Indian residential schools were in operation at the same time that Carleton was. We know many universities were involved in experiments on children in the schools. Did Carleton participate in any of them? We know that universities are also had various relationships with church entities. What was Carleton's involvement with the churches that ran the Indian residential schools? I know of one. Carleton School of Journalism helped the Oblates develop a communication strategy to manage negative public attention that it was facing. What further involvement did Carleton have, especially given that you were located in the national capital and so close to the policy and decision makers? I urge Carleton to look in its own archives for any records that may relate to Indian residential schools. And I urge you to urge the other universities to do the same, because that's what's required for reconciliation. Gathering oral tellings from survivors who have information on where potential burials are located continues. Communities require the equipment and supports to gather statements in a culturally safe way. Access to and protection of sites is needed. Many of the sites of the former Indian residential schools are now owned by private entities, the provincial crowns, or municipalities. Access to these grounds must be facilitated. And finally, immediate and sufficient health supports are required. Each time a community announces that it's starting its search or has found anomalies in their search, the trauma resurfaces. I encourage all of you to think broadly about how Carleton can support this work moving forward and continue to build on the good work you have already done. Whether it is through political activism, fundraising, providing PhD research support to communities leading this work, there are many ways that you, as professors, as students, as an institution, can contribute to supporting survivors, Indigenous families, and communities who are engaged in the sacred work of recovering the children. It is all of our responsibilities. I will end with this quote from survivor Chief Bobby Joseph, who organized the first Walk for Reconciliation in Vancouver and started Reconciliation Canada. He said, "Reconciliation includes anyone with an open heart and an open mind who is willing to look to the future in a new way. Let us find a way to belong to this time and place together. Our future and the well-being of all our children rests with the kind of relations we build today." And so with that, I say, let us all work together so that we can, as the song we just heard earlier, bring the children home. So now I miigwech. Thank you, merci, merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for such a powerful keynote address. You've given Carleton, you've certainly given me a lot to think about and how I wish to move forward with my own academics and actually how I'm going to move forward in terms of how I wish to teach and educate my class, my students. So thank you so much for that. So we're coming to the end of our event. It's been an incredible event, really powerful. I'm so deeply moved and grateful, and I'm actually kind of proud of myself for not like breaking down and crying uncontrollably, because I sometimes do that when I do presentations such as these ones, because it is incredibly personal for me, and it's also deeply sad when you actually think about what's happening in this country and what has happened and the type of trauma that continues to happen in this country. So it is, it's sad. That's all I could say. It's very, very sad. So as we wrap up and we carry on with our day, I would ask that each of you do some self-care. Love yourself enough to take the time to reflect and remember and heal your heart and your soul, because this has been very, very difficult information that we've been talking about, but information that we have to have and continue to have, because that's how change happens, and that's how reconciliation happens. So I'm going to call upon Elaine to come back and close us down properly. You're welcome to stay and take closer looks at the vamps as we bring closure to today.
Let the still